All right, so welcome to our Vaccines Past, Present, and Future workshop hosted by your Give Vaccines a Shot team here at Science North. My name is Melissa Rose, and I'm going to be your blue coat for this workshop today. I'm excited to be here to talk to you all about vaccines, how they came to be, where they've been, where they are, and where they're going. And so why they're so important for and how they're such an amazing tool for public health. So before we jump into talking about vaccines, I thought it'd be a good idea to talk a little bit about why we need them. So let's start talking about pathogens. So let's talk about some of the things that can make us sick. So pathogens are any tiny things that can cause diseases in human beings. So some examples of these are bacteria, viruses, parasites, fungi, things like that. So they do this in a variety of ways, but what I wanted to do is focus on two very specific type of pathogens. So we're going to dive in a little bit closer, and we're going to have a look at viruses and bacteria. So they're found in almost every single ecosystem on Earth. They're everywhere. And you might have heard these terms being used interchangeably, but there's actually a lot of differences between the two, and I want to dive into those just briefly. So what's really, really interesting is that viruses aren't actually alive. They don't meet the criteria that living things have. So there's a list of things you need to have for being a living thing, like growing and moving and all of those things. And one of those things is reproducing, so making more of your cells. So living things are capable of doing that, whereas viruses, they can't. They can't do that. Bacteria can. And so one of the big things is because viruses can't replicate by themselves, they actually need to do so inside our cells. So any living thing cells, the virus will go into it and use their cells to make more copies of themselves. If you just take a virus and put it on a counter, it just stays there. Nothing happens. Whereas a bacteria, if you put the bacteria on a counter and you give it no food or water or nutrients, it'll also just disappear. It just won't be able to do anything. But if you give a bacteria nutrients on that countertop, it can replicate by itself. It doesn't need our cells. So it's a small distinction, but I wanted to talk a little bit about this because how we treat them is a little bit differently. So you can't treat a virus with antibiotics. If you've heard, oh, I've got the flu, I'll just take some antibiotics. It's not going to work because what we use are antivirals. So it actually translates loosely to against, so antiviral viruses. So they're medications that can be used against viruses. And so antibiotics are against bacteria. And so those can be used against bacteria. They won't be effective against viruses either. And antivirals won't be effective against bacteria. There's also antifungals and things like that. So different types of medication for strep throat, urinary tract infections, and a few different things like that. You've probably heard of antibiotics before. You may not have heard of antivirals. So I'd like to give you a couple of examples of what antivirals are. So antiviral medications are there to like ease symptoms and shorten how long you're sick. Examples of some are hepatitis B, hepatitis C, HIV, influenza. So those are some diseases that antivirals can be used to fight off. So now that we've done that, antivirals can be used in like cream. You can inject them into the muscle or via an IV. You can have eye drops. So there's a couple different ways to administer antiviral medication. Now, another word that starts with antigens. And so antigens can be found on pathogens. So those pathogens, those viruses, bacteria, fungi, things like that, can have these things on their surface. And those things on the surface can be called an antigen. And you can think of it as like the pathogen's hands. So it's what's going to allow them to grab onto our cells and infect our cells and interact with our cells. So a general kind of description of what an antigen is any foreign molecule or substance that can trigger an immune response. So basically, anything that's going to trigger our body to create antibodies is an antigen. So how does it do this? Well, think of them like little puzzle pieces. So here's an antigen, it's right there. It's got a very specific shape, and the antibody here has essentially, it's going to form like a puzzle piece. So they can only fit and they can only bind and attach to very specific shapes of antigen. And they do this at what we call an antigen binding site. So basically, again, two puzzle pieces, they snap together. But as you can see on the screen, there's a few different shapes of antigens, and this antibody can only bind to this specific antigen, which means if multiple different viruses have this same antigen on the surface, that antibody can bind to all of those different viruses as long as the antigen is the same, which is very cool. That doesn't always happen, which is why when a different virus with a different antigen or a different bacteria or pathogen with a different antigen on its surface shows up, your body needs to create new antibodies. Once your body has an immune response to an antigen and it creates those antibodies are going to essentially help your body fight off the germ by recognizing the antigens and then mark them for destruction. So it's pretty cool system of what happens. But I mentioned that not all different germs have the same antigen, but what I want to talk about is it's this fancy thing called antigenic drift. And so antigenic drift is when one specific germ has genetic changes that happen over time. So the influenza viruses, like flu viruses, do this, I want to say quite rapidly, that they essentially will mutate and change even throughout the course of like one season, which is why we recommend flu shots every year, because as you can see, if you look here, we have a beautiful antibody that's going to bind to the antigen on the surface of this virus, which is wonderful and amazing. Now, that's what our body created after we got a vaccine, for example. But what happened is, over time, the antibodies we created with that little binding site, when the virus has shifted and mutated over time, that same antibody that we produced when we got the previous infection or if we got the vaccine for this previous infection, it doesn't fit anymore. Those puzzle pieces don't fit anymore because the virus has changed. And so when we have one virus that has changed, it's what we call a new strain of the virus. So if you've heard of the word strain, that's what it is. It's the same virus that has changed to have a different, essentially like outer shell to it. Same family, same thing, but different kind of outer coating, which means our body's going to need to learn to fight it differently. Now that we've talked about very, very briefly about the things that make us sick, how do we not get sick? Well, there are some preventative measures that we can take in just overall healthy life choices. So having an overall healthy life is great, and it helps keep us healthy. So getting plenty of sleep, physically active, managing your stress levels, drinking plenty of like water and fluids, eating healthy foods, all of those are just good to have as part of your general healthy lifestyle. Now, when it comes to additional measures that you can take when it comes to preventing diseases are good overall habits. So think of like the healthy lifestyle as like your baseline. This is what I need to keep my body happy. The next one is, now my body is happy. What happens when I go to different places where there might be things that can infect me? So hand washing is always a great idea. Don't touch your eyes, nose, or mouth if you are in a place that other people have touched. You don't know where their hands have been, and they don't know where yours have been, and therefore it's probably a good idea to just avoid bringing any germs towards openings in your body where those germs can infect, causing illness. Avoiding close contact with people who are sick. If you are sick, or if you know you're going to a place that there's going to be some sick people, or we don't know where those people have been, wearing a mask is always a good idea as well. It helps reduce your risk. And if you are sick, staying home is a way that you can help out others. And so these are just overall good habits to have to prevent the spread of disease. Now, we'll chat about some additional measures. I'm assuming, maybe, this might be incorrect, but I assume we've all most likely heard of the word quarantine. The word quarantine actually just means isolating a person or an animal that's been exposed to a disease. So if there's one person who's been exposed to a particularly dangerous disease, we put them in a space until they don't have that disease anymore, and then they can come back. That's what quarantine is. Now, if that disease has already spread and has spread around the world, sometimes we decide to quarantine larger amounts of people. And so quarantine doesn't always mean a large group of people. All it means is you're isolating someone who has a disease or has been exposed to a disease. So that's all it is, which is great. But the single best way to reduce the risk of getting infection is immunizations. So essentially, it's the process of becoming immune to something, to the different diseases and things like that. So typically, this is done by the administration of a vaccine. So getting vaccinated is a type of immunization. That is a very safe way of becoming immune to a disease. Technically, getting the disease, getting all the symptoms from the disease and all the risks that comes with getting the disease, and then fighting off the disease and you're like, I beat it, it's gone, amazing. That's also immunization because you've become immune to it. But again, you have all the risk associated with getting the disease, whereas vaccination is also immunization, but it's a safer way and a safe way to fight off and to learn how to fight off disease. So now that we've touched on some like high level general information, let's jump into the history of vaccination, where it's been, where it's going, and all of those things. So historical vaccination, and I have vaccination in brackets for a reason, because it didn't start off as being coined vaccination. It wasn't exactly that. So I'd like to take a trip back in time with you to the first and oldest, or to the oldest documented case of variolation. And it dates back to about the 16th century when the first documented cases of this happened. Another word for it can be inoculation, but variolation is a very specific type of inoculation that's used and was used to immunize people against the smallpox virus. And so variolation comes from the word variola, because the smallpox virus is called the variola virus. So that's where the name variolation comes from. So what is variolation? Well, it's not my favorite thing, and I'm glad this is no longer how we try and prevent disease. Essentially, with smallpox, people would get sores on their bodies. What variolation entails is, or was, taking material from the infected person's sores and putting it onto the arm or inhaling through the nose of an uninfected person. So the reason they did this was because the risk of getting sick and dying and having severe reaction to the actual virus, like the actual virus getting sick from an actual person, was quite high. So it was quite dangerous. So what they did was, by scratching the material, they introduced like a very small amount of that virus. It's called a small viral load. And so what happens is, when they gave the small amount, people got less sick, which makes sense. You get less of it, you're less sick. And so it was actually 10 times less likely to cause like severe health issues and death than getting sick by the actual virus. And so it was a really great way at the time to reduce the risk of people getting sick. Now, I'd love to talk to you a little bit about this person. Their name is Dr. Edward Jenner, and they, in 1796, came up with this really, really cool idea. It's wicked cool. He noticed in milkmaids that worked with cows that cowpox produced similar symptoms, but milder symptoms than smallpox. And what was really interesting is that he noticed that smallpox was very dangerous, but cowpox, when people were infected with cowpox, it was less dangerous, and they were immune to smallpox, which is very interesting. And so what happens is, this is where the term vaccine kind of came from, because essentially he would take the cowpox virus and do the same concept by scratching the sores of someone who has cowpox into a healthy person, and they would then produce an immune response to the cowpox, which protected them against smallpox, because they were similar enough that the body's immune response fought off both types. So it was very cool, and that's where the word vaccine comes from, is from the Latin word vacca, which is for cow. So pretty cool little history about where vaccination kind of came from. And so it started as variolation, and again, as it became safer, so because there's still risk associated with variolation. People still got sick, they still got smallpox, but it wasn't as bad. And so the idea is, as we move towards vaccines, it got safer to essentially use and do this technique. Speaking of techniques or strategies, there was a very interesting strategy called ring vaccination. And it was the first line strategy in eradicating smallpox. And so instead of just vaccinating people, what they did was they vaccinated the close contacts, or the direct contacts, and then the people who are in close contact with those contacts of people who have actually been infected with smallpox. And so essentially, there was an infected case, they protected everybody who was in direct contact with that direct case, or in close contact with them. So this was a very specific, it's a little bit different than what we have now. But essentially it was a very important strategy and a very important type of vaccination strategy to eradicate and move towards the eradication of smallpox. So again, that's called ring vaccination. So now that we've talked a little bit about like the history of where vaccination came from, I'd like to talk about some of the vaccines that we have now. So one type of vaccine that we have now is the live attenuated vaccines. So live attenuated vaccines mean it uses a weakened virus. So yes, it is a live virus, but it's so weakened that it doesn't have the capability to actually make you sick, as long as your immune system is functioning properly. And so there's a very, 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 very small chance, if you're immunocompromised, that they might give you an actual reaction to a live attenuated vaccine, which is why some of these aren't recommended for certain groups of immunocompromised people. But unless you are immunocompromised or fall within a very specific group, this virus is so weakened it can't make you sick. You get it from the vaccine, but it still produces an immune response. And so how it does that is actually pretty cool. So when the weakened virus enters your cells, what happens is your cells go, oh, cool, this is instructions on how to make copies of this thing that has been introduced to my body. And what it's going to do is it's going to make copies of those viruses. Again, they are weakened and they can't give you the disease. They're too weak. They can't. And so once those weakened viruses are just kind of floating around, our body does what our body does very, very well, and it's going to go fight off those things. And so what happens, it's going to bind to that weakened virus. It's going to learn what its antigens are, so what the antigen presenting cell is going to fight this virus. And then if we're ever exposed to the actual virus that can make us sick, then it's going to be able to fight it off much, much faster. So some examples of this, you might have heard of measles, mumps, rubella, varicella, so MMRV or MMR vaccine. Those are typically live attenuated vaccines. Rotavirus, yellow fever, smallpox, some influenza viruses, and then typhoid vaccines are live attenuated vaccines. So these are not always recommended for everybody. So if you do have any questions, you're more than welcome to ask your healthcare provider. But again, in any healthy, uncompromised person, I guess, these are perfectly, beautifully safe. So that's this most similar to what variolation is, because it was, again, a live weakened version. So kind of step up. Now we have a safe inactivated vaccine. And so what's very, very cool is that this actually uses dead viruses or bacteria or pathogens, which means there is no chance ever that it can even replicate. So it has no chance of making you sick, 0%. It just won't happen. So even immunocompromised people can get inactivated vaccines. They're good. They're great. Because they use dead viruses, they don't actually produce as strong of an immune response, which means these are ones that usually have like booster shots throughout the years. So for example, tetanus. So if you've heard of tetanus, tetanus is an inactivated vaccine, which is why it's recommended every 10 years to get your tetanus shot. So what happens is, because they can't replicate, your cells is just going to go, oh, and break it apart. And it's going to break it into pieces that are called antigens. And then the cell, again, is going to do what your body is very good at doing. And it's actually going to display them on the surface of the cell. And then this cell with these antigens goes, hello, I have antigens on my surface. I am a foreign object. Please come and learn how to fight me. And so your immune system is going to bind to those antigens and create an immune response that is going to prevent or essentially learn and remember how to fight off any diseases that have those specific antigens. So very, very cool. Some examples of these are polio vaccines, rabies vaccines, and some influenza vaccines are inactivated types of vaccines. And then we'll dive into one more specific type of vaccine, which is the mRNA vaccine. And you may have heard of this one. But essentially, same as the inactivated vaccine, it will not replicate inside your cells. Therefore, there is no chance of you getting the disease from the vaccine. It's messenger RNA. So RNA, it's like a little messenger that has a code of instructions to teach your cells how to make those antigens or those proteins. So essentially, it's just like a little like postal worker that brings the instructions into your cells. And then your cell is going to read that message. It's going to be able to make the target proteins or just part of the target protein. And it's going to do exactly what your cells do. It's going to show those antigens on its surface. And your immune system is going to learn to fight off anything with those specific antigens. Now, once mRNA, or essentially once your body has read the instructions, they don't need it anymore. So think of it as like a little, like you've written down from the cookbook of all the fun things, you've written down like a little recipe, and you've taken that recipe and you've made only that part of the recipe on like a little post-it note. I'm just going to throw the post-it note away afterwards. So essentially, when it's not used for anything, our body just gets rid of it. And so once it's read, and once we've read that target protein message, our body just disposes of the like broken down pieces afterwards, after like a couple days. So it has no chance of reintegrating into your cells or anything like that. And so it's a really cool technology that we'll dive into a little bit farther later. But essentially, this is not all of the different types of vaccines. There's a few different types. Sometimes they just use the protein and inject the protein. There's a few different ways that they do it, but these were the three that I wanted to talk about. So the live attenuated, the inactivated, and then the mRNA vaccine were the three I wanted to kind of focus on a little bit more today. If you have any questions about those, or you want any more clarification, you're more than welcome to ask at the end. Now, sometimes when we get vaccines, they're for one specific thing. So we got the COVID-19 vaccine was just for COVID-19, but that's not always the case. With combination vaccines, they're actually designed to protect against 2 or more diseases, or of one disease that's caused by different strains. And so what's really, really interesting is that your body is capable of fighting off and learning how to fight off multiple diseases with just one vaccine. So I'm going to talk about a couple of these. So the MMR, or the MMRV. MMR vaccine is against measles, mumps, and rubella. In children, we have a similar combination vaccine that also includes varicella. So that'll be MMRV. In adults, MMR is usually the vaccine that is given. The next one is the Tdap vaccine. And so the Tdap vaccine includes your tetanus, diphtheria, and acellular pertussis, or whooping cough, if you've heard of that. And so similarly to what I mentioned earlier, tetanus is one of those that you're recommended to get every 10 years. So you can either get the Tdap, or again, a similar combination vaccine, which is just the TD, which is tetanus and diphtheria, and it's recommended every 10 years. The next one is Twinrix. And so Twinrix protects against hepatitis A and hepatitis B. This is one that you might have heard of because it's typically one of the ones that is recommended if you want to go traveling around to protect against hepatitis A and B. Now, some other vaccines are the pneumococcal vaccine. This is recommended for those of you who are typically a little bit older, a little bit over 50 years of age. And so the pneumococcal vaccine is essentially going to protect against infections that are caused by the Streptococcus pneumoniae bacteria. And so these infections can lead to some more serious illnesses like pneumonia, meningitis, and sepsis, some blood infections and things like that as well. And so these are really recommended to help protect against those because they can get, it can lead to some more serious infections. And the next one is Shingrix. And so Shingrix, it protects against shingles. And so chickenpox and shingles are related because they're both caused by the same virus. They're caused by the varicella zoster virus. And so if a person has had chickenpox in their lifetime, the virus stays dormant in the body. So it just stays, it's inactive, it's not causing any symptoms after you've recuperated, but it stays in your body and it can reactivate years later and cause shingles. So this one is also recommended for those 50 and over. So now that we've talked about some of the vaccines that exist and we have those, I'd like to talk about the future of vaccines and where they're going because it is very, very exciting. So I said I would come back to it. I do want to talk about mRNA vaccines. So yes, you might have heard that mRNA was first used, first ever time against COVID, which is not entirely correct. mRNA technology has been around a long time. It's been used, in example, for studies against flu, Zika viruses, rabies, cytomegalovirus. There's a few different like studies that have been using it against these types of viruses. And they've also been using mRNA technology to trigger immune responses that can target certain types of cancer cells, which is very, very cool. So yes, it was the first time it was widely used in like around the world for a vaccine against COVID-19. But it doesn't mean that the technology didn't exist before. It's not the first time it's been used. It's been around a long time, and it's been a really amazing technology. And one of the reasons, or some of the reasons, are it can actually be developed faster than a lot of the other vaccines because the materials are easily available. And the way that it's developed, you can adapt it to new strains a lot faster. Because of how it works. Essentially, very surface level, because it's a little messenger, you can essentially just think of it like, instead of having to redo the whole thing, so think of a Lego person, instead of having to rebuild the entire thing, you can just like swap the Lego pieces when the new antigen is present on the virus. So like put a different hat on the Lego person and it's a new person. They have a new job and they're able to fight off this new version or new strain of the virus. So it's a lot faster to develop, which is really cool technology, especially when it comes to viruses that mutate also very quickly. We can get on top of making vaccines for those a little bit faster, which is awesome. Now we'll dive into DNA vaccines. So DNA vaccines work very similarly to how mRNA vaccines work, that it uses part of a pathogen's DNA that codes for the surface protein. So it doesn't use the whole virus, it just uses a part of that virus's DNA, because again, some viruses have RNA, they have DNA. We won't dive into too much of that, but essentially whatever genetic material is in that virus, they can use part of the DNA that codes for that protein to make a vaccine for that. And so what's very interesting is that it hasn't been approved for widespread use in humans yet for a vaccine, same way as mRNA vaccines weren't used widespread until COVID-19, but that doesn't mean that the technology hasn't been used yet. There are absolutely clinical trials where in veterinary use, which is very cool. They've been using DNA vaccines for to fight like West Nile virus and like in horses and melanoma, so cancers in dogs, which is interesting. And then there are human clinical trials with DNA vaccines that are being used to treat cancers and to treat HIV as well. So it's a very cool technology that's coming, that exists. There's trials in process. And one of the pros, I guess, to DNA vaccines instead of mRNA is that DNA is a little bit more stable than mRNA. So just it's a little bit of a added benefit. It makes it a little bit easier to work with. And so another thing I really kind of wanted to like just quickly mention is our technology is evolving, and our medical knowledge and all of that. Science is evolving, science is learning. And so we're producing vaccines that against diseases that never had vaccines before. So one of the really cool ones is against malaria. So the malaria vaccine was only recently approved in like 2021 and is now being a little bit more widespread used as of like December of 2023, which is really, really cool. And that's a parasite. So malaria is an infection caused by a parasite, and it's actually one of the first vaccines that's successful at fighting off parasitic infections, which is very, very cool. And so we're learning and we're able to fight off more and more of these diseases and prevent more and more of these diseases, which is really, really cool. So vaccines are a very cool and awesome technology at preventing the spread of diseases. Now, speaking of spreading diseases, I'd like to talk about epidemiology, which is a big fancy word that is just basically the study of how diseases spread. And so I want to talk about a couple of different keywords that you might have heard of, you might not have heard of, but essentially the first one is an epidemic or an outbreak. So an epidemic is when there's more cases of a disease than it's expected in a certain area. So an outbreak is essentially, it's very, very similar. It's just typically a little bit smaller scale. So essentially it's when there's more cases than what we expect there to be in that area. Whenever there's more cases than expected, that's called an epidemic or an outbreak. Now, what happens if an epidemic spreads a little bit farther into, for example, multiple countries or continents? So when an epidemic occurs over several countries or several continents, it's called a pandemic, which you've probably definitely heard of that word. And some examples of pandemics that have happened in the past and that have happened. AIDS is a pandemic. We have the influenza H1N1 is one example of a pandemic. and then SARS, and then SARS-CoV-2 specifically is the one that you may have recognized the name from, so the COVID-19 pandemic. So SARS, there was a SARS pandemic earlier in the early 2000s, I believe, as well. And SARS-CoV-2 is just the most recent one that we have. Now, those are when there's more cases than we expect in an area or in multiple areas. But what is it called when we just know that there's this disease there? It's called an endemic. So the endemic is when there's a constant presence of a disease in a given like area. So we know it's there, we know it happens, we know it exists in that area, and it doesn't become an epidemic until there's more numbers than we expect. So there's a constant presence of the disease in a geographical area, and some examples of this are yellow fever and measles. Now, what's really cool about measles for us in Canada is that, yes, it's an endemic in Europe. So measles is an endemic in Europe, but it's actually been eliminated here in Canada since 1998. And so the elimination of a disease is when a disease doesn't have the natural ability to exist in a given area. And so essentially what happens is when enough people have become immunized to a specific disease in a specific area, different diseases have different infectious rates, which means different amounts of people have to be immune to it. But essentially, when people in a specific area have become immune to a specific disease enough that it can't spread naturally, it's when they kind of get the title of being eliminated. So the title of elimination here in Canada, we have measles and polio. So those are two examples of diseases that have been eliminated and hold the elimination title here in Canada, which is very cool. Now, does it being eliminated mean that there aren't going to be cases that pop up here and there? No. There will be cases that pop up here and there, but what happens is it doesn't have the ability to go farther. It doesn't really have the ability to become an epidemic if it's been eliminated, and there's that in a perfect situation, which is lovely. So speaking of perfect, beautiful, amazing situations, the ideal is eradication. So the eradication of a disease is when it's been completely eliminated from the world. And so instead of just being eliminated in Canada, when a disease has been eliminated from the entire world, it's called eradication. And there's only one human disease that's been eradicated, and that holds the eradication title so far, and that is smallpox. And so kind of brings us back to the original like historical vaccination that was against smallpox. And so it's lovely to see that elimination worldwide, so-called eradication, is totally possible and there. So it's very, very exciting. And so I did want to say thank you. That's everything word-wise that I have to share with you today. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump into our trivia game. And so what we're going to do, I'm going to give you the opportunity now, if you'd like, grab a pen, paper, scrap piece of paper if you don't have the printed out template or anything like that. Keep score if you'd like to keep score of how well you did. All right, so welcome to the Give Vaccines a Shot trivia game. It's very exciting. You may recognize the template of this game, but essentially we're going to have 6 different categories, and you're going to have a chance to answer questions in those categories and keep track of those scores. So what we'll do is I'll give you the titles of the categories, and then we'll just go one by one. And so the first category that we're going to look at today is our words that start with anti. So words that start with anti is our first category. Secondly is our preventative measures category. The third category is going to be all about epidemiology. Our next category is going to be all about the different types of immunization. The next category, or the fifth category, is going to be our specific vaccines category. And the last one, I wanted to throw in a few fun facts for you. And so those are our 6 categories. And what you'll see on the screen here is our 6 categories there. And so what we're going to be doing here, all of the information in the first 5 categories is all information that we would have talked about in the presentation. And the fun facts, I just wanted to give you a few fun facts. So what we're going to do today is we're going to start with our first $200 question in the words that start with anti category. So if you need a little bit more time, I'm going to give you a few seconds after I'm done answering the question. So hopefully that gives you enough time. So the first question is, this is a type of medication that treats infections caused by bacteria, like strep throat or urinary tract infections. So what is this word that starts with anti something? If you wanted to, you can write your answers in the chat, which would be interesting I'd like to see what you think. You're more than welcome to answer those or put those in the chat. So for the answer for our first question, what are antibiotics? So if you said antibiotics, good job. You can add yourself $200 for that question. The second question in the words that start with anti category is the $400 question. So this meaning against virus. This type of medication is capable of destroying or weakening viruses, such as hepatitis B, hepatitis C, HIV, and influenza. If you said, what are antivirals? Good job. You can give yourself $400 for that question. On to our $600 question in the words that start with anti category. These things help the body fight off germs by recognizing the antigens found on the surface of those germs and mark them for destruction. So, a couple of hints in the corners if you're a visual person. What are these things that help the body fight off germs? If you answered, what are antibodies? Congratulations. You can add $600 to your total. All right, now on to our fourth question in the words that start with anti category. These are things that can be found on the surface of pathogens and are capable of causing disease. So they can trigger an immune response, which usually leads to the production of antibodies. So what are these things? If you answered, what are antigens? Good job. You can give yourselves $800 for that question. Our last question in this category is our $1,000 question, and this is caused by genetic changes in the virus that leads to a new strain of the virus, which means antibodies that were produced by a previous infection or being previously vaccinated with the original strain, the antibodies cannot effectively fight this changed virus. So what is this word that starts with anti? If you answered, what is antigenic drift? Good job. Honestly, if you got antigenic, I'll give that to you. Good job. All right, that's it for our first category. Next category is preventative measures. Now, preventative measures. Making good lifestyle choices can play a role in staying healthy. So this is an example of good overall health habits to prevent the spread of disease. So what would be a good overall health habit to spread or prevent the spread of disease? If you answered, what is hand washing, not touching your eyes, nose, or mouth, avoiding close contact with sick individuals, wearing a mask or staying home if you're sick, Any one of these answers is beautiful and well done. So you can give yourselves $200 if you answered any one of those. For our second question in the preventative measures category, it's our $400 question. This is a way to prevent the spread of disease by isolating a person or an animal that has been exposed to a disease. So what is this called? If you answered what is quarantine, absolutely. Great job. You can give yourselves $400 for that question. For our third question in the preventative measures category, this is the process of being made immune or resistant to an infectious disease, and it's typically by the administration of a vaccine. So if you answered what is immunization, good job, absolutely wonderful. You can give yourself $600 for that question. Next is our $800 question for preventative measures. This specific type of vaccine uses a live but weakened virus that produces an immune response without the severe effects of the disease. Examples include measles, mumps, rubella, varicella, rotavirus, yellow fever, smallpox, and some influenza and typhoid vaccines. So what is this type of vaccine called? If you answered what is a live attenuated vaccine, you just said attenuated, that's great as well. You can give yourselves $800 for that question. Good job. And the last question in this category is the preventative measures question. It's our $1,000 question. This is a vaccine made from viruses and bacteria that have been killed through physical or chemical processes. So they are dead, and these killed organisms cannot cause disease. So some vaccines include polio, rabies, and some influenza vaccines. If you answered what is an inactivated vaccine, good job. You can give yourselves $1,000 for that question. All right, on to epidemiology category. Question 1 is this is the occurrence of a disease within a specific geographical area or population in excess of what is normally expected. So if you answered what is an epidemic or an outbreak, absolutely, you can give yourselves $200 for that question. Good job. Our $400 epidemiology question. This is an epidemic that occurs over several countries or continents. So some examples include AIDS, influenza, and the SARS-CoV-2 virus. If you answered what is a pandemic, great job. You can give yourself $400 for that question. For our $600 epidemiology question, this is the constant presence of a disease in a given geographical area. So some examples of this are yellow fever and measles. So what is the constant presence? If you answered what is an endemic, congratulations, give yourself $600 for that question. All right, so for our $800 question in epidemiology, this is when a disease no longer naturally exists in a given geographical area. So measles and polio are two diseases that hold this title in Canada. So what is it when it can't naturally exist in an area? If you answered what is elimination or eliminated, absolutely, congratulations. You can give yourselves $800 for that question. And our last question in the epidemiology category is, this is the elimination of a disease from the world. The only human disease to hold this to date is smallpox. So smallpox is the only one that holds this title. If you said, what is eradication? Good job. You can give yourself $1,000 for that question. Congratulations. All right, for our fourth category, the types of immunization, we'll start with our $200 question. This historical technique led to the development of vaccines. It involves the transfer of matter from a smallpox sore into or onto the skin or into the nose of an uninfected person. So what is it called when they transfer matter from a smallpox sore to an uninfected person? If you answered what is variolation or inoculation, you can give yourselves $200 for that question. For our second question in the types of immunization category, this type of vaccine is designed to protect against 2 or more diseases or against one disease caused by different strains. So what is this called? If you answered what are combination vaccines, good job. You can give yourselves $400 for that question. Now, for the $600 question, this is a vaccine that uses a messenger to teach our cells how to make a protein, or even just a piece of a protein, that produces an immune response to a disease. So if you answered what is the mRNA vaccine, absolutely, congratulations. You can give yourself $600 for that question. For our $800 type of immunization question, this is a new type of vaccine that hasn't yet been approved for widespread use in humans yet, but it is being used in clinical trials to treat cancers and HIV. If you answered, what is a DNA vaccine? Absolutely, congratulations. Give yourselves $800 for that question. And our last question in the types of immunization category, this was the first line strategy in eradicating smallpox. So this vaccination strategy involves vaccinating likely contacts of the infected person and people who were in close contact with those contacts. So what was this one called? So if you answered what is ring vaccination, good job. You give yourselves the $1,000 for that question. Now let's dive into our specific vaccines category. The first question. This is the name of the vaccine that is effective in preventing measles, mumps, and rubella. In children, a similar combination vaccine often includes varicella. What is the name of this vaccine? If you answered what is the MMR vaccine, congratulations, give yourselves $200 for that question. Now, for our $400 specific vaccines question, this is the vaccine that is effective in preventing tetanus, diphtheria, and acellular pertussis, or whooping cough. So this or a similar combination vaccine is recommended every 10 years. If you answered what is the Tdap vaccine, good job. Give yourselves $400 for that question. For the $600 specific vaccines question, this vaccine helps prevent against shingles, which is given to adults 50 years of age or older. So what is the name of this vaccine? So this one was Shingrix. So if you said, what is Shingrix or Shingrix vaccine? Good job. Give yourselves $800 for that question. For the $800 or the fourth question in the specific vaccines category, the Twinrix vaccine is a combination vaccine that helps prevent against these two types of which disease? If you said, what are hepatitis A and hepatitis B? Good job. You can give yourselves $800 for that question. And our last question in the specific vaccines category for $1,000. This vaccine helps prevent any type of illness caused by the bacteria Streptococcus pneumoniae. Their use can prevent some cases of pneumonia, meningitis, and sepsis. So what is this vaccine? If you answered what is the pneumococcal vaccine, good job. Give yourselves $1,000 for that question. All right, now for the fun facts category, I'm very excited for this one. The first question in the fun facts category is a multiple choice question. They're always wonderful. So, immunization currently prevents how many deaths every year from diseases like diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, influenza, and measles? So how many deaths does immunization or vaccination prevent against every year? Is it 500,000, 1 to 2 million, 3.5 to 5 million, or 12.3 to 14 million? If you answered 3.5 to 5 million, congratulations. Absolutely well done. You get $200 for that question. On to our second question in the fun facts category. This one's going to make you think, maybe, hopefully, a little bit. RSV is a virus that usually infects or causes infections in your lungs that produce a mild cold-like symptoms, but in severe cases, it can lead to pneumonia or bronchiolitis. So what does the R in RSV stand for? So if you said the R stands for respiratory, good job. So RSV stands for respiratory syncytial virus, so RSV. And if you are over the age of 60 or 60 or older, there's actually a vaccine that helps, that's available for you to protect you against RSV, which is very, very cool. Now, for our $600 fun facts question. Shingrix is a vaccine to help protect against shingles. For adults who are 50 to 69 years old, the Shingrix vaccine was what % effective in preventing shingles? Was it 50% effective, 73% effective, 80% effective, or 97% effective? So if you answered 97% effective, congratulations, very well done. You can give yourself $600 for that question. And in adults 70 years old and older, Shingrix was 91% effective. So yes, there was a decrease in effectiveness as you age. So getting it earlier provides you with more protection, which is great. All right, now for our fourth question in our fun facts category. The World Health Organization has an eradication strategy for this disease that can infect a person's spinal cord and can cause paralysis in more severe cases. So historically, an iron lung was used to support a person's ability to breathe until they could recover. So what is this disease? So if you answered What is poliomyelitis or polio? Congratulations, you can give yourselves $800 for that question. And my last question for all of you today, our $1,000 fun facts question. A vaccine was recently approved in 2021 and is the first vaccine to prevent this parasitic infection spread by mosquitoes. So what is this infection called? What is this disease called? If you said, what is malaria? Congratulations, give yourselves $1,000 for that question. All right, so that is all the questions I have for you. We've finished our trivia game now. It's time to count what you have. If you'd like to do that, you're more than welcome to keep track and add up everything that you've gotten. We would love to hear from you what you got. So if you did want to comment or add in what you got, that would be amazing. We also have a survey that I would love if you could answer. The survey is going to allow us to read all your comments. You can give us feedback. We're going to be able to take that feedback, and if you have any suggestions for how to improve or what to do the same or what you do different, we'd love to hear from you about how you thought this went and if you have any feedback or comments. So it'd be really, really great to hear from you if you wanted to answer that survey. So that will be sent, that will be added in and sent to you in the follow-up email. And it'll also be in the comments or in the chat. So if anybody did want to do that, that would be great. I also wanted to thank you for taking the time with me today. I really appreciate all of you being here today.